So here it is, the Yongnuo 14mm f2.8, and the first thing you'll notice is it's actually rather a hefty lens. I was expecting it to be really light and plasticky, and it's actually not. The lower barrel is definitely plastic, but up here at the top bit is actually metal. Front element, we have a nice little protection. Back element, we also have a protection. Better get them off. So the focus ring seems to turn quite smoothly, has a lot of rotation to it, which would be good for video work. You'll notice, however, if I switch it over to autofocus mode, the manual focus has now been removed, so it doesn't have any manual override. The weight is actually getting a lot to me. It even weighs, compared to a Canon 24-105, this thing's even heavier than that, so I am very impressed with the weight of it. Let's get it onto a camera body, and let's see what the autofocus works like. Wow, that's actually a lot quieter than I was expecting. I was honestly expecting a very noisy, clunky system, but that's actually quite quiet. So the autofocus is certainly a lot quieter than I was expecting. It's not quite as quiet as Canon's USM, but it's certainly a lot more usable than I was predicting. So I think it's time to get out and about with this lens and see how it performs. So now that I've spent a bit of time out and about shooting with the new Yongnuo 14mm lens, I can kind of give you a bit more of a comprehensive idea as to what this lens is like to actually use. I suppose the first thing about this lens that I should talk about is the very first thing that I noticed as soon as I took it out of the box, and that's just the sheer weight of the thing. It's an absolutely colossal lens, which I was not expecting. I used to own the Samyang 14mm f2.8, and that was a very lightweight lens, and I was kind of expecting the same from this, a kind of Barbie doll level of plastic from it. But it really took me by surprise as to how heavy the thing actually is. The Canon 14mm f2.8L that this thing is based off weighs 22.5 ounces. This weighs 27. It's 5 ounces heavier than the premium Canon lens that they've based it off. I really was not expecting that kind of weight for a lens that's £500. A lot of the weight from this lens appears to come from this very thick metal lens hood that they've got around the top of the barrel, which is great from a point of view of protecting that front glass element. Now, I'm not an idiot. In fact, sometimes I am an idiot, but I am not a complete moron. I'm not going to drop test this thing to prove that it protects the element or not. But I do get the feeling if you were to accidentally drop this face first, that front glass element is going to be pretty well protected behind this lens. The only problem with having a design like that is even though the lens itself is relatively short, the majority of the weight is situated in the front half of the barrel. So the lens is very, very front heavy. Even on a big camera body like this, a Canon 5D Mark III, the lens feels very, very front heavy. So using a smaller body like a 6D or an 80D, you're gonna notice that front tip even more. And plus the weight as a whole does start to take its toll after a while. I've been walking around with this thing all day and you really do start to feel it after a while. The next thing that surprised me about this lens was its autofocus. Not that it had autofocus, but just how quiet the thing was compared to what I was expecting. If you see my preview video about this lens, you'll know that I mentioned it having a direct drive motor, which is primarily what Yongnuo tend to use. But every other lens that Yongnuo has released, the 35, the 50 and the likes, when they autofocus, they all sound like R2-D2 having a fit while falling down a stairs. And that's what I was expecting from this, a very slow, grinding autofocus. But it's not actually the case. Just to demonstrate, this is what the Yongnuo sounds like up close when it's autofocusing. And this is what Canon's 24-105 f4L sounds like. So granted, the autofocus from the Yongnuo lens isn't quite as quiet as the ultrasonic systems that you would find from other manufacturers. But realistically, that isn't a loud autofocus system. You could quite easily shoot a wedding ceremony or something like that with this lens and not draw attention to yourself. And the autofocus speed isn't particularly fast compared to the ultrasonics either, but realistically, the majority of people who are going to be looking for a 14mm lens don't really require ultra fast autofocus either. And compared to pretty much all the budget level 14mm lenses, this is the only one on the market so far that actually has autofocus. One feature of this lens that I didn't mention during the unboxing, which I'll point out now, is the inclusion by Yongnuo of a USB port onto the back of the lens. So it means in the future, if Yongnuo ever release a new software to fix a reliability or compatibility issue, instead of having to send the lens back to them for them to update the software, you can just plug this into your computer, download the firmware straight onto the lens, and off you go. So it seems so far, despite costing 3.5 times less than the Canon, in terms of the build quality of the lens and the autofocus, it's certainly within 3.5 times of the performance. But now the important question, what are the images like? Okay, so first off we'll have a look in some detail at some of the sample photos that were taken while I've been out and about with this lens, and then I'll show you a couple of very unscientific tests that I've done of a brick wall to test sharpness and vignetting and distortion. Okay, so the very first photo I've got is one that you saw earlier. It's of the Ferris wheel in Albert Dock, and if we zoom in on the middle here to 100%, you don't get very close because you're dealing with such a very wide angle lens anyway. It's kind of hard to zoom in great detail, but you can quite clearly see that the middle of the frame is very, very sharp. Now if we move over to the side, you can see a drop in sharpness. Part of this is to do with just the lens's quality, part of it is to do with the objects that are in view not actually being on the same plane of focus, so are kind of slightly out of focus naturally. But let's move on to another image. So here we have a closer view of the same Ferris wheel. This really highlights the extreme perspective that you can get with something like a 14mm lens. That Ferris wheel is absolutely huge, and I am basically standing directly underneath it, and yet I can still fit the entire thing in the frame with room to spare. Now this one wasn't shot wide open at f2.8, this was actually stopped down to f5.6. Now if we zoom into 100% on the picture, you can see that there is very, very high levels of sharpness all the way across the frame. In the middle of the image, and even looking at the carts of the Ferris wheel that are very far away, you can still make out all of the detail within them, which is impressive. Moving on, this is another image you might have spotted earlier on. This is at the seafront by Albert Dock. They fitted the old metal chains with a padlock on every single link, and it really is a sight to behold. This does highlight two things about this lens. Firstly, lenses with wider and wider focal lengths inherently have naturally deeper and deeper depths of field, so getting an out of focus background with an ultra wide angle lens can be very tricky. Thankfully, this lens does have a minimum focus distance of only 20 centimeters, which allows you to get very close to your subjects, such as this, and then push those backgrounds out, and having that f2.8 aperture does help with that. Zooming in on the padlock that was in focus, you can see that there is still a very decent level of sharpness, despite being shot at a wide open aperture. Now, just to show you a quick comparison as to how much difference a very small focal length change can make, this photo here was actually taken with the Canon 16-35mm f4 lens at 16mm, and this is the Yongnuo at 14. So as you can see, that extra 2mm can actually make quite a difference to your scene and allow you to get a lot more of the scenery in. You'll also notice down at the bottom the sun coming through the trees. Now I shot this at f11, and this just goes to show what a nice effect the 7-bladed aperture of the Yongnuo lens does in creating a nice 14-point sunburst. And just to show you what it's capable of for you astrophotographers, here's a night sky shot as well. So we can see that the 14mm field of view is brilliant for astrophotography, and that f2.8 aperture really does help as well. So looking up into the corners, you can see that the lens does display a small amount of coma in the extreme corners, but realistically, given the ultra-wide angle, it is pretty well controlled. And we finally move on to what everybody's been waiting for, the brick wall. Now, you can see there is some distortion in the lens. In an ideal world, this would display all of those bricks as completely straight lines, but unfortunately, to the top and bottom, those lines actually bend inwards towards the center. This is partly just inherently physics of an ultra-wide angle lens, but it also has something to do with the fact that I had to be so close to the wall in order to get the photo in the first place. So for taking scenery shots and stuff like that, realistically, you aren't going to see as much distortion as you see here. So with the aperture wide open at f2.8, we see a reasonable level of sharpness in the center of the frame, whilst unfortunately in the corners things are a little soft and there is quite a lot of vignetting as well. Good news is, if we stop the lens down to f4, we see a vast improvement in brightness from those corners, as well as extra sharpness, not just in the corners, but also in the center of the frame as well, giving us very good sharpness all the way across the picture. By f5.6, the vignetting is all but disappeared, and we have absolutely brilliant sharpness all the way across the frame, and sharpness remains pretty much the same at f8 and at f11. So who is a lens like this aimed at? Well, primarily ultra-wide angles tend to be used for interior architecture photography, landscapes, and astro. On the astrophotography front, as we've already seen in the sample photos, this lens does work really well for astrophotography. It does display a degree of coma, but realistically all ultra-wide angle fast aperture lenses do display coma, so this thing's no different. From an interior or architecture point of view, again, this is probably one that people may consider if they are on a budget. Wide open sharpness, as we've seen, isn't the best, but generally if you are stopping the lens down to f4, f5.6 anyway, this thing performs really well. Now, on a landscape front, however, you may want to consider something a bit different for a couple of reasons. Firstly, this thing isn't weather sealed, so if you're going out and about quite a lot, you're going to need to keep it covered up. Then there's the weight. As I've said already, this is not a light lens, which means if you're going out and about walking all day, this might not be an ideal lens for you. Plus, it doesn't have image stabilization, which may be an issue if you are trying to take handheld photos with a slower shutter. Then there's the issue of filters. Now, none of the 14mm primes on the market have the ability to take screw-on front filters because they have that big bulbous front element. However, the lenses from Canon and Sigma both have the ability to mount a gel filter onto the back, which this doesn't have. So if you're going to be using filters for this lens, you are going to need to buy an external filter holder to mount over the front of the hood. So if you are in the market for a wide-angle lens primarily for landscape photography and you can afford to lose 2mm of focal length and around about a stop of light, I would probably recommend you consider something like this, the 16 to 35mm f4. I'd recommend this pretty much because it solves all of the problems that the Yongnuo presents for shooting landscape photography. This lens is a lot lighter, so travelling around with it is going to be easier, plus it has image stabilization, which is going to help. Then it gives you the versatility of a zoom range, so you're able to change your composition if you want. Then there's the fact that it has weather sealing, which means that you can take it out and about in the elements and not worry. And it takes very common 77mm front filters as well. So what if you are in the market for a 14mm prime, but you don't want the Yongnuo? What are your alternatives? Well, your cheapest alternative would be the old Samyang 14mm f2.8, which they no longer make, but you can pick it up secondhand for around about £300. In terms of image quality, it's probably around on par with the Yongnuo. However, in terms of build quality, it doesn't come close. It's a very plastic lens, which does mean it weighs less, but it does feel like it's going to break all the time as well. It's also a fully manual lens, which means not only is it a manual focus lens, but it also has a manual aperture ring that you have to dial in the aperture for, and there are no electronic contacts on the back, which means that all of that aperture information doesn't get saved onto your photos, and also the light metering can be a little bit off on the camera at times. Your next alternative is Samyang's replacement to that lens, which is their 14mm f2.4 SP. Now the 2.4 version does have improved image quality and build quality over their old 2.8, which means image quality wise it's probably slightly better than the Yongnuo. In terms of build quality, it's probably on par. While the 2.4 is still a manual focus lens, it does at least have an electronic aperture this time, as well as the electronic contacts for saving that information and for the improved light metering. However, that lens is £900, making it almost twice as expensive as the Yongnuo. If you are looking for the ultimate astrophotography lens, then you are going to be looking at Sigma's 14mm f1.8 lens, which lets in a stop and a third more light than the Yongnuo. That also comes with Sigma's very quiet and fast ultrasonic autofocus motor, as well as weather sealing. And being one of Sigma's art lenses, the thing is built like a tank. However, it also comes with a very big price tag, around about £1,400, making it nearly 3 times more expensive than Yongnuo. Or you also have the Canon 14mm f2.8 that this lens was modelled off. So being a Canon L-grade lens, you get L-grade build quality, L-grade image quality, weather sealing, and a fast autofocus. You also get an L-grade price tag, £1,700, making it 3.5 times more expensive than the Yongnuo. So ultimately you wind up with the age-old question of how much do you want to spend for the performance that you want to get. Yes, there are lenses out there that will perform better than the Yongnuo, but for the price that you are paying for the Yongnuo, for the performance that you are getting, it is really worth a consideration. And that's the key point to remember about Yongnuo lenses. They are not the best quality lenses on the market. However, for the price that you pay versus the performance that you are getting, they are absolutely one of the best value lenses to look at. Obviously, if you are a professional photographer looking for an ultra-wide angle lens for basically making your living, then you're probably going to be looking towards one of the higher end lenses such as the Sigma or the Canon. However, if you are somebody who's working to a budget, or you just want to dabble with ultra wide angle without wanting to commit to the heavy price tags of those bigger lenses, then the Yongnuo is definitely one that I would recommend you consider. So there we are, the Yongnuo 14mm f2.8. It certainly impressed me, but did it impress you? Leave your comments down below and let me know what you think. Are you somebody who's in the market for an ultra-wide angle lens and you are now considering the Yongnuo? Are you somebody who already has an ultra-wide angle lens and you're now considering switching to the Yongnuo? Are you somebody who had no interest in an ultra-wide angle lens at all and now having seen this you're considering buying the Yongnuo? I apologise. Or do you think that this is a complete waste of space and best used as a paperweight? Let me know what you think. If you haven't already guys, please hit that subscribe button so that you can be the first to see all my new videos. If you did like this lens review, please give it a thumbs up, it's always appreciated, and until next time, I will see you later.